Kicked out at 16. Orphan, dusty police station. What he found inside changed everything. If you've ever felt like the world had already decided who you were, then this story is for you. Stick around and maybe subscribe, because we're building a community here for people who know what it's like to find your own way. The day I turned 18 was the day I legally ceased to exist as a problem for the state of Oregon. There was no cake. There was no party. There was just a cardboard box containing 2 changes of clothes, a worn copy of a book my grandfather once read to me, a toothbrush, and a manila envelope that felt far too thin to hold a future. Ms. Albright, my caseworker for the last 2 years, stood in the doorway of the group home, her expression a practiced blend of sympathy and professional distance. The air was cold for May, a damp chill that promised rain and clung to the gray fabric of my state-issued hoodie. "Well, Leo," she said, her voice even, "this is it. You're officially an adult." I nodded, the motion feeling stiff and foreign. Adult. The word tasted like ash. For 2 years, every decision, from what I ate for breakfast to what time I had to be in bed, was made for me. Now I was supposed to make them all. I looked past her at the peeling paint of the porch, the overgrown lawn that was perpetually damp, the chain-link fence that separated this life from the one I was about to be thrown into. Freedom was supposed to feel light. This felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. "Do you have everything?" she asked, a routine question. I hefted the box. "Everything that's mine." She gave a tight, sad smile and handed me the manila envelope. My name, Leo Vance, was typed neatly on the front. "This came for you, from the public trustee's office. It's your grandfather's estate." I stared at her, my mind going blank. His estate? Gramps didn't have anything. We lost the house when he got sick. My grandfather, Arthur Vance, had been my entire world until he was swallowed by a hospital, and I was swallowed by the system. He was a quiet man, smelled of pine soap and old paper, and his hands were always steady. He'd been gone for 5 years. 5 years of foster homes, then this group home, 5 years of being a file in a cabinet. "Apparently he had one thing," Ms. Albright said, her tone softening slightly. "A piece of property. The deed is in there. And this." She dropped a single, heavy, old-fashioned iron key into my palm. It was ornate, pitted with age, and cold to the touch. "That's for the property." I opened the envelope right there on the porch, my fingers fumbling with the metal clasp. Inside were a few folded documents, crisp and official. A letter from a lawyer I'd never heard of, and a deed. I scanned the legal jargon, my eyes catching on the address. It wasn't a house. It wasn't a plot of land. It was listed as 1 Silver Creek Road, Silver Creek, Oregon. And under property type, one word: municipal. Ms. Albright must have seen the confusion on my face. "It's the old police station," she said, her voice quiet. "Your grandfather bought it at a town auction years ago after it was decommissioned. I don't know why. The records are sparse." An abandoned police station, in a town I'd only vaguely heard of, a place deep in the mountains, forgotten by the main highways. That was my inheritance. A punchline to a joke I didn't understand. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. A police station? What am I supposed to do with a police station? "Well," she said, crossing her arms as if to ward off the chill or perhaps my own despair. "That's the other part of the news. There are back taxes owed, about $5,000. If they're not paid, the county will seize the property and sell it." She paused, letting the weight of that settle on my shoulders. already burdened by the small bucks of my life. However, there's an offer. A development company, Redwood Corp., has been trying to acquire that land for a while. They've made a standing offer to buy it as is, and they'll cover the tax debt. It would leave you with about $10,000. $10,000. To me, it was a fortune. It was a security deposit on an apartment. It was food for months. It was a bus ticket to somewhere, anywhere else. It was a clean break. It was the smart choice. The only choice, really. All I had to do was sign a paper. Forget a past I barely remembered, and a grandfather whose memory was already fading into a sad, blurry photograph in my mind. "The lawyer's number is in the packet," Ms. Albright continued, her voice pulling me back. "He can process the sale for you. You just have to call him. You can stay at the youth shelter downtown for a few nights while you get it sorted." I looked down at the iron key in my hand. It felt impossibly heavy. My grandfather had been the police chief in Silver Creek a long, long time ago, before I was born. It was a part of his life he never spoke about. A closed door. He'd left that town and never looked back. So why buy the one building that tied him to it? Why leave it to me, his only family, a boy he had to know would end up adrift? It made no sense. It was a loose thread in the tightly woven narrative of my grief, a narrative that said he was a good man dealt a bad hand. This felt different. It felt like a message I couldn't read. "What if I don't want to sell?" I asked, the words surprising me as much as they did her. Her carefully neutral expression flickered. "Leo, be realistic. It's a derelict building in the middle of nowhere. It's probably not even habitable. The taxes are piling up. This offer is a gift. It's a start, a real start." I knew she was right. Every rational part of my brain screamed that she was right. Take the money. Find a room to rent. Get a job washing dishes. Survive. That's what the last 5 years had taught me. Survival was the only goal. But the key in my hand was a question, and the thought of my grandfather, the kindest man I'd ever known, leaving me a final, complicated puzzle. I couldn't just throw it away without looking at it. I couldn't reduce his last act to a $10,000 check from a faceless corporation. "There's a bus that goes to Cascade Locks," I said, my voice finding a strange, unfamiliar firmness. "From there I can get a transfer to a county line that runs up near Silver Creek." Ms. Albright sighed, a long, weary sound. It was the sound of a woman who had seen too many kids make the wrong choice for the right-seeming reasons. "Leo, what are you going to do when you get there? You have maybe $200 to your name." "I'm going to look at it," I said simply. "I'm just going to look at it." I needed to stand in the place that my grandfather had left me. I needed to understand why. Maybe it was a ruin. Maybe it was a mistake. But it was his mistake, and it was mine now. She watched me for a long moment, her gaze searching my face. I think she was looking for the scared kid she'd processed 2 years ago. Maybe she saw a flicker of him, but he was buried under something else now, something harder, something that had been forged in the quiet loneliness of the system. Finally, she nodded, a slow, reluctant acceptance. "All right, Leo. It's your life. It's your choice." She reached into her purse and pulled out a $20 bill, folded and crisp. She pressed it into my hand. "For the bus and a meal. Call me if you get into trouble. You have my number." "I will," I lied. We both knew I wouldn't. The umbilical cord to the state was cut. I was on my own. I turned and walked down the cracked concrete path, not looking back. The weight of the box was familiar. The weight of the key was not. One represented the life that had been forced on me. The other, the other felt like it could be the start of a life I chose. The bus ride was a long, slow crawl out of the city's gray embrace and into the deep, wet green of the Oregon mountains. I watched the landscape change through the smudged window, the strip malls and suburbs giving way to towering Douglas firs and winding roads that hugged the edges of cliffs. The air inside the bus was stale, a mix of disinfectant and diesel fumes. I sat with my box on the seat beside me, a silent companion holding the sum total of my worldly possessions. With every mile that passed, the city's noise faded, replaced by the rhythmic hiss of the tires on wet asphalt and the low rumble of the engine. My mind, for so long occupied with the simple, immediate calculus of survival in the group home, avoid this person, don't rise to that bait, keep your head down, was now a vast, empty space. And into that space, memories of my grandfather began to seep in, like fog rolling into a valley. I remembered his workshop in the back of our small rental house, the smell of sawdust and varnish. He was always fixing things, a wobbly chair for a neighbor, a broken toaster, my own scuffed-up toys. His hands, though large and calloused, were incredibly gentle. He could mend the delicate wing of a model airplane with the same patience he used to reset a fence post. He never raised his voice. When I was angry or upset, he wouldn't try to talk me out of it. He would just sit with me, his quiet presence a solid, reassuring anchor until the storm inside me passed. He taught me how to tie a proper knot, how to read a compass, how to listen to the forest, and tell the difference between the sound of the wind and the sound of a creek. But he never, ever talked about being a cop. I knew he had been, in the same vague way a kid knows their parents have first names. It was a fact, but not a story. When I'd asked him about it once, when I was maybe 10, he'd just gotten a distant look in his eyes. "That was a different life, Leo," he'd said, his voice softer than usual. "A different man." And that was that. The door closed. Now, that door was the only thing he'd left me. The bus wheezed to a stop in Cascade Locks, a small town huddled by the Columbia River, overshadowed by the massive steelwork of the Bridge of the Gods. I had a 2-hour wait for the county line, a smaller, older bus that looked more like a shuttle van. I spent Ms. Albright's $20 on a hot cheeseburger and fries at a riverside diner. It was the best meal I'd had in years. I ate slowly, making it last, watching the rain fall on the river, turning the surface into a million shifting circles. For the first time, a sliver of real fear cut through my strange sense of purpose. Ms. Albright was right. What was I doing? I was chasing a ghost into the woods, armed with a rusty key and $180. The smart thing to do was to get back on a bus to Portland, call the lawyer, take the $10,000, and start the sensible, grim business of being an adult. But the memory of my grandfather's quiet strength held me there. He never did anything without a reason. He was a methodical man. If he bought that building, there was a purpose behind it. He wouldn't have left me a burden. He would have left me something else, a responsibility, a chance, a test. I didn't know which. The county bus was mostly empty, just me and a couple of older women with grocery bags. The driver, a man with a thick gray beard and a flannel shirt, gave me a curious look as I paid my fare. "Silver Creek? Not much up there anymore, son. You visiting family?" "Something like that," I said, not wanting to explain that I was on my way to take possession of a derelict police station. The road into the mountains grew steeper and narrower. The pavement was cracked and patched, and in some places it gave way to gravel. The forest crowded in on both sides, the trees so tall and thick they blocked out the already fading afternoon light. We passed a few mailboxes nailed to posts at the end of long, unseen driveways, but mostly there was just the woods. It felt like traveling back in time. After another hour, the driver called out, "Silver Creek Junction, this is you." He pulled over at a spot where a smaller, even more neglected road branched off into the trees. There anymore. Not enough people to make there anymore. Not enough people to make it worth the gas. I thanked him, grabbed my box, and stepped out. The bus pulled away with a groan of gears, its red taillights disappearing around a bend, leaving me in a profound and intimidating silence. The only sound was the drip of water from the trees and the faint rush of a distant river. The air smelled of wet earth, pine needles, and decay. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like a blanket. I adjusted the box in my arms and started walking. The road was more of a paved trail, slick with moss and littered with fallen branches. The forest was a solid wall of green and brown on either side. It was beautiful and terrifying. I felt impossibly small. After about 15 minutes, the trees began to thin. I saw a rooftop, then another. A sign, so faded and weather-beaten it was barely legible, announced, "Welcome to Silver Creek. Population 142. The number was crossed out, and a smaller, hand-painted 78 was scrawled underneath. The town was a ghost of itself. A handful of houses, some with lights on, others clearly abandoned, their windows dark and empty like eyes. A general store with a flickering neon sign that read, "Beer." A post office that looked like it hadn't been opened since the turn of the century. And there, at the very center of it all, at the intersection of the main road and a dirt lane, was my inheritance. It was a single-story brick building, squat and solid, with a flat roof and barred windows. The words, "Silver Creek Police Department," were carved into the stone lintel above the double wooden doors. The brick was dark with age and moisture, and ivy crawled up one side, threatening to swallow a window whole. A single, bare flagpole stood out front, its rope slapping against the metal in the light breeze. It was bigger than I expected and more imposing. It didn't look like a ruin. It looked like something that was sleeping. I walked up the 3 concrete steps, which were cracked and sprouting weeds. My heart was pounding in my chest, a nervous, frantic rhythm. This was it. I stood before the doors, took a deep breath, and slid the heavy iron key into the lock. It resisted at first, stiff with rust and disuse. I put my shoulder into it, turning with all my weight, and with a loud groaning clank, the lock turned. The sound echoed in the quiet street. I pushed the door open. It swung inward on protesting hinges, revealing a wall of darkness and the smell of dust, damp paper, and something else, something metallic and cold. I stepped inside, out of the rain and into the past. The door swung shut behind me, the latch clicking with a sound of finality. I was home. The darkness inside was absolute. The barred windows let in only the faintest slivers of the overcast afternoon, not enough to see by. I fumbled along the wall, my hand brushing against peeling paint and cold brick, searching for a light switch. My fingers found a bank of old, heavy-duty toggle switches. I flicked them, one by one. Nothing. The power was off, of course. I should have expected that. I pulled out my phone, its screen a startlingly bright beacon in the gloom. I turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting a sharp cone through the thick, dusty air. I was standing in what must have been the main lobby or reception area. A heavy wooden counter, scarred with decades of use, ran the length of the room. Behind it, a door stood ajar, leading to a back office. To my left was a hallway. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, so thick that my footprints were the first to disturb it in what must have been years. The air was frigid, colder than it was outside, and utterly still. My breath plumed in the beam of my light. I ran my hand along the top of the counter. The dust was like a fine gray powder. Beneath it, the wood was solid oak. This place was built to last. I swept the light across the room. A calendar was still hanging on the wall, the picture a faded landscape of Mount Hood. The month was June, 1998. The year the station closed, I guessed. 25 years of silence. I walked behind the counter, my footsteps unnervingly loud in the quiet. The office was small. A metal desk, a filing cabinet, and a chair that had tipped over, as if someone had left in a hurry. Papers were scattered across the floor, yellowed and brittle. I picked one up. It was a standard incident report, the details typed out on a manual typewriter. The ink was faded. I let it fall back to the floor. This was a place of ghosts. I felt like a trespasser, an intruder in a time capsule. I left the office and moved down the hallway. The first door on the left was the chief's office. A small tarnished brass plate said, A. Vance, my grandfather's office. My breath caught in my throat. The door was closed. I tried the knob, but it was locked. I tried the iron key, but it didn't fit. I pressed my ear to the wooden panel, as if I could hear something from the other side, a whisper from the past. There was only silence. I continued down the hall. The next two doors opened into small, identical interrogation rooms, each with a bare metal table and two chairs bolted to the floor. The air in them felt heavier, charged with old fear and desperation. At the end of the hall was a heavy barred door. The holding cells. It was unlocked. I pulled it open and stepped into a small block of two cells. They were cages of steel and concrete, each with a simple cot and a toilet. The smell of rust and cold despair was overwhelming. I imagined the men who had been locked in here, their hopes shrinking to fit the tiny, grim space. I backed out quickly, pulling the heavy door shut. This place was starting to get to me. The weight of all the sadness and anger that had passed through these walls was settling on my shoulders. I returned to the lobby, my small adventure feeling less like a discovery and more like a mistake. The building was empty. It was a shell. There was nothing for me here. Ms. Albright had been right. I should sell it. I should take the money and run, and never look back. It was getting dark outside, and the cold was seeping into my bones. I had nowhere to go. The idea of sleeping here, in this dusty mausoleum, was unsettling, but the alternative was sleeping outside in the rain. I set my box down on the counter and took out my only book. I could read by my phone's light until I fell asleep. I decided to make one last sweep of the place to make sure I was truly alone. I went back to the small office behind the reception desk, the one with the tipped-over chair. I shone my light into the corners, under the desk, inside the empty drawers of the filing cabinet. It was as empty as it seemed. But as I was about to leave, the beam of my phone caught something on the floor, half hidden under a drift of dusty papers. It was a small brass key, much smaller than the iron one for the front door. It was on a simple metal ring, and it looked like a key for a cabinet or a lockbox. My heart gave a little thump. I picked it up, wiping the dust from its surface. There was one locked door in this whole building. I walked back down the hall to my grandfather's office and slid the small key into the lock on the doorknob. It fit perfectly. With a soft click, the lock turned. I pushed the door open and shone my light inside. This office was different. It was larger, with a big wooden desk and a tall window that would have looked out onto the main street. But what made me stop in the doorway was that it wasn't empty. Unlike the rest of the station, which felt abandoned, this room felt preserved. The desk was clear, except for a single leather-bound blotter. The chair was pushed neatly under it. A bookshelf on the far wall was filled with law books and local histories, all perfectly aligned. It was as if my grandfather had just stepped out for a moment and was expected back at any minute. The dust in here was thinner, as if the room had been better sealed against the passage of time. My light beam drifted across the desk, the chair, the bookshelves. Then it landed on something in the corner, behind the desk. It was a heavy, military-style footlocker, a trunk made of dark green metal with heavy latches on the front, and a padlock. I walked over to it, my boots making soft sounds on the wooden floor. I knelt down. The padlock was old and thick. I tried the small brass key in it, but it didn't fit. Of course not. It was never that easy. I looked around the room, a frantic energy seizing me. A key. There had to be a key. I checked the desk drawers. They were all empty. I ran my hands along the spines of the books on the shelf, behind them, on top. Nothing. I felt a surge of frustration. It was right there. A locked box, in a locked room, in a building he had left for me. This had to be it. This had to be the reason. I sat down on the floor, my back against the cold metal of the trunk, and shone my light around the room again, slower this time. I looked at the walls, the floorboards, the ceiling. My eyes traced the outlines of the furniture, and then I saw it. On the wall behind the desk, where a coat rack might have been, was a single, solitary nail driven into the wood paneling. And hanging from it, almost invisible in the dim light, was another key. It was a simple steel key, the kind used for a padlock. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs. I took the key from the nail. It was cold and solid. I knelt back down, my hand shaking slightly as I inserted it into the padlock on the footlocker. It slid in smoothly. I turned it. With a loud, satisfying snap, the lock sprang open. I pulled it off, unhooked the latches, and lifted the heavy lid of the trunk. The air that rose up to meet me smelled of old paper, leather, and cedar. My phone's light fell upon the contents. The trunk was filled with dozens of thick brown envelopes, all tied in bundles with twine. On top of the first bundle was a single, smaller envelope. In my grandfather's familiar, neat handwriting were 2 words: "For Leo." My throat went tight. This was it. This was the message. I reached in and took the envelope. My hands were trembling now. I sat on the floor of my grandfather's office, in the cold and the dark, and I opened the letter from the man who had been dead for 5 years. Come of age. And you have found your way, come of age. And you have found your way here. I am so sorry, my boy. I am sorry for leaving you. I am sorry for the life you have had to lead since I've been gone. None of it was what I wanted for you. I had to stop and take a breath, my eyes burning. His voice was so clear in my head, reading the words, his calm, steady tone. It was like he was in the room with me. I continued reading. I imagine you are sitting in my old office, confused and probably angry. You have a right to be. You're wondering why I left you this broken-down building in a forgotten town. You're probably thinking about the offer from the Redwood Development Corp. I know about them. They've been circling this property for years, like vultures. I want you to know you can take their money. You can sell this place, walk away, and never think of Silver Creek or me again. There would be no shame in it. You deserve an easy start, and God knows you've earned it. If you do that, burn this trunk and everything in it, and live your life freely. That is my first gift to you, a choice with no strings attached. I paused, the weight of that choice pressing down on me. He was giving me an out, a clean escape. But I knew I couldn't take it. Not now. Not after finding this. I read on. But if you are still reading, then you must have a part of me in you. A stubborn piece that needs to know the why of things. And that is my second gift to you, the truth. This building isn't an inheritance, Leo. It's a confession. It's a witness. It's the story of why I left this town and why I could never truly leave it behind. My light was trembling, casting dancing shadows on the wall. I was the chief of police here for 15 years. I believed in the law. I believed in justice. I thought I was doing good work in a good town. I was wrong. This town has a sickness, Leo. It's a rot that goes deep, and it's controlled by one family, the Abernethys. They owned the lumber mill, the general store, the land. They still do. They built this town, and they believe they own the people in it too. For years I looked the other way on small things. It was easier. It was how things were done. I told myself I was keeping the peace. I was a fool. The next paragraph was harder to read. The ink was darker, as if he'd pressed the pen down with more force. Then, 28 years ago, a young woman disappeared. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. She was a waitress at the local diner. She was bright, and she wanted to leave Silver Creek, go to college. She had a fight with the youngest Abernethy son, a cruel, spoiled boy named Thomas. He was used to getting what he wanted. He wanted Sarah. She said no. Abernethys closed ranks. They produced no body. The Abernethys closed ranks. They produced alibis. They threatened witnesses. They owned the sheriff in the next county. The investigation went nowhere. They called it a runaway case. But I knew. I couldn't prove it, but I knew I had let a murderer walk free because I was a coward. The guilt of it ate me alive. It's the reason I left the force. It's the reason I left this town. I took your father, who was just a boy then, and we started over. But I never forgot Sarah. I never forgave myself. He had carried this burden his whole life. This quiet, gentle man who fixed my toys had this darkness inside him. It recontextualized everything I knew about him. His sadness, his quiet nature, his reluctance to ever talk about the past. Years later, after your parents were gone, and it was just you and me, I started hearing whispers. The old mill was closing down. The town was dying. And the Abernethys were starting a new company, Redwood Corp., buying up all the cheap land. They wanted to erase the old town and build luxury cabins for tourists. They wanted to bury the past. When this station came up for auction, I knew I had to have it. I used every penny I had saved. Because this building holds the secret. I couldn't prove what happened to Sarah back then, but I never stopped looking. And before I left, I took the evidence, the real evidence. The files that went missing from the official case. The witness statements people were too scared to give on the record. Everything. It's all in this trunk, Leo. I looked from the letter to the trunk full of envelopes. It wasn't just a collection of old papers. It was a cold case. It was a woman's life. It was a town's ugly secret. This is the choice I am leaving you, my boy. A terrible, heavy choice. In this trunk is the truth. If you bring it to light, you will make powerful enemies. The Abernathys are richer and more influential than ever. They will fight you. They will try to crush you. The world will not thank you for digging up a 30-year-old grave. Or you can take their money, burn these papers, and let the ghosts of this town sleep. You can be safe. I will not blame you, Leo. Your safety is all I ever wanted. All I ask is that you choose. Don't just drift. Make a choice and live with it. Whatever you decide, know that I loved you more than anything in this world. Be a good man. Your loving grandfather, Arthur. I finished the letter and let the pages fall into my lap. The silence in the office was deafening. My phone's flashlight flickered, the battery dying. The room plunged into near total darkness. I sat there for a long time, the weight of my grandfather's words pressing down on me. He had left me a key to a building, but it was really a key to his soul. He had shown me his greatest failure, his deepest regret, and asked me to be its keeper. For a moment, I let myself feel the anger. How could he do this to me? I was 18 years old, with nothing and no one. I was supposed to be figuring out how to pay rent, not how to solve a murder and take on a powerful family. It was too much. It was unfair. I cried then, not for myself, but for him. For the good man who had been broken by a system he believed in. For the years he carried that guilt in silence. For the love that made him try to protect me, even from beyond the grave, by giving me an easy way out. I thought about Sarah Jenkins, the girl who just wanted to go to college. Her story was buried here, in this cold, dark room. If I walked away, it would be buried forever. The Abernathys would win. They would pave over the past, build their fancy cabins, and her memory would be nothing more than dust under the floorboards. I thought about the $10,000. It was real. It was safety. It was a ticket out of this cold, damp life. I could be in a warm apartment in a week, anonymous and free. No ghosts, no fight, just survival. But what kind of survival would that be? It would be the same kind I'd practiced for the last 5 years. Head down, don't make waves, disappear into the background. My grandfather had given me a choice, not between safety and danger, not between wealth and poverty. He had given me a choice between the person the system had tried to make me and the person he believed I could be. A man who stands for something. A man who isn't a coward. A man who finishes the fight. My phone died completely, leaving me in the pitch black. But the darkness didn't feel scary anymore. It felt clear. I knew what I had to do. The decision settled in my bones, not with a crash, but with a quiet, solid click, like a lock finding its tumbler. This was my home now. This was my fight. I spent the night in my grandfather's office, wrapped in my thin jacket, sleeping on the floor with my head resting on the footlocker. It was the best I'd slept in years. The next morning, I woke up stiff and cold, but with a sense of purpose I'd never felt before. The gray morning light filtered through the grimy window, illuminating the small room. My first task was simple: exploration and inventory. I needed to know exactly what my grandfather had left me. I spent the entire day going through the trunk. It was a meticulous, heartbreaking archive of a dead investigation. There were official police reports, stamped unsubstantiated. There were transcripts of interviews, full of inconsistencies and nervous evasions. But the bulk of it was my grandfather's own work, done in secret after he'd left the force. There were notebooks filled with his neat, precise handwriting, documenting the timeline of Sarah's last day. He'd interviewed people years later, off the record, and their stories were different now, free from the immediate pressure of the Abernathy family. One man, a former mill worker, admitted he'd seen Thomas Abernathy's truck heading up the old logging road late the night Sarah disappeared, a road that led to nowhere but abandoned quarries. Another, a waitress who had been Sarah's friend, gave a sworn, notarized affidavit stating that Thomas had been stalking Sarah for weeks and that she'd seen him grab her violently during their final argument, whispering something in her ear that made her go pale with fear. These were stories people had been too afraid to tell a police chief who they knew was powerless against the town's real authority. But they had told Arthur Vance, the man, because they trusted him. The most damning evidence was a small cassette tape, wrapped in a plastic bag with a label that read T.A. phone tap. It was an illegal wiretap, a recording my grandfather must have made in desperation, a complete abuse of his power, and an act that would have cost him his career and sent him to prison if discovered. He had risked everything. I had no way to play the tape, but I knew with absolute certainty that it was the key. This was what the Abernathys were truly afraid of. This was the ghost that haunted their clean corporate image as the Redwood Development Corp. I carefully packed everything back into the trunk except for the affidavit and the tape. I needed to find a way to get power back on in this building. I needed to find a tape player, and I needed to find out who I could trust. My stomach rumbled, a reminder of my more immediate problems. I had no food, no water, and about $180. I left the station, locking the heavy doors behind me, and walked toward the center of town, which wasn't much of a walk. The general store was my destination. The flickering beer sign was off, but a small, hand-painted, open sign hung in the window. I pushed the door open, a small bell tinkling overhead. The inside was dim and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. Shelves were sparsely stocked with canned goods, bread, and hardware supplies. An older woman with sharp blue eyes and a cloud of white hair sat behind the counter reading a newspaper. She looked up as I came in, her expression neutral but observant. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Just need to get some supplies," I said, trying to sound casual. I grabbed a loaf of bread, some peanut butter, a few cans of soup, and a large jug of water. I also found a pack of heavy-duty flashlights and a mountain of batteries. As I set the items on the counter, she eyed me up and down. "You're not from around here." It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am," I said. "My name's Leo Vance." I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Recognition. "Vance," she repeated softly. "Arthur's grandson?" Word travels fast in a small town. Or maybe my grandfather was just a hard man to forget. "That's right." She finished ringing up my items. "That'll be $42.50. I paid her, and as she handed me my change, she leaned forward slightly. "A piece of advice, Arthur's grandson," she said, her voice low. "Some things in this town are better left buried. People round here have long memories and short tempers." It was a warning, a clear, unmistakable warning. She wasn't being hostile. It felt more like she was being kind, trying to protect a kid who didn't know what he was getting into. "Thank you, ma'am," I said, meeting her gaze. "I'll keep that in mind." I left the store with my supplies, her words echoing in my head. The town was watching me. They knew who I was, and they were afraid of what I might do. It was both terrifying and validating. It meant my grandfather was right. There was something here worth fighting for. Back at the station, I set up a small living area in the main lobby. I had a flashlight for light, canned soup for dinner, and the floor for a bed. It was grim, but it was mine. My next project was power. I found the building's breaker box in a utility closet. It was ancient. I checked the main fuse. It looked intact. The problem had to be with the connection to the grid. The next day, I used my dwindling funds to buy a cheap prepaid cell phone from the general store and called the county power company. The conversation was short and frustrating. Service to 1 Silver Creek Road had been disconnected in 1998 for non-payment. To have it restored, I would need to pay the outstanding balance of over $2,000, plus a reconnection fee, plus a hefty deposit because the property was commercial. It was an impossible sum. I was about to give up when I remembered something I'd seen in the back of the station, a small, locked shed. I'd assumed it was for storage. I went back and examined the lock. It was rusted solid. I spent the better part of an hour smashing it with a loose brick from the front steps until it finally broke apart. Inside the shed, under a dusty tarp, was an old, heavy gasoline generator. It was my grandfather's. Of course it was. He was a man who planned for everything. He knew the power would be cut. He knew I would need a way to be self-sufficient. I spent the rest of the day cleaning it. The fuel lines were clogged, the spark plug was fouled, but I had watched him work on engines my whole life. His lessons came back to me, my hands remembering movements my mind had forgotten. I siphoned some gas from a rusted-out lawnmower behind the shed, cleaned the plug, and after about 20 pulls that left my arm aching, the generator sputtered to life with a deafening roar. I found a heavy-duty extension cord and ran it from the shed, through a broken window in the back, and into my grandfather's office. I plugged in a single lamp I'd found in a closet. And then, for the first time in a quarter of a century, there was light in the Silver Creek Police Department. It felt like a monumental victory. The warm, yellow glow pushed back the oppressive gloom, making the office feel less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary. Now for the tape. I needed a cassette player. It seemed like an ancient artifact, something you'd only find in a museum. But this was Silver Creek. The general store was a museum of sorts. The next morning, I went back to see the old woman. "Looking for something else?" she asked, not looking up from her crossword puzzle. "I was wondering if you might have an old cassette player," I said, "for sale, or maybe know someone who does." She finally looked at me, a long, appraising stare. "Why would a boy your age need a cassette player?" "I like old music," I lied, my heart beating a little faster. She held my gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slow nod, as if she'd come to a decision. "I might have something in the back." She disappeared for a few minutes and returned with a dusty, portable Sony tape recorder. It was the exact kind of thing a cop might have used for interviews. $20, she said, placing it on the counter. "No guarantees it works." "I'll take it," I said, pulling out my last $20 bill. As I was about to leave, she spoke again. "My name is Martha," she said. "Your grandfather, he was a good man. He tried his best." It was the first kind word anyone other than Ms. Albright had said to me in years. It meant more than she could ever know. "Thank you, Martha." Back in the office, with the generator humming outside, I put new batteries in the tape player. I took the cassette from its plastic bag, my hands slick with sweat. I pushed it into the machine, and with a deep breath, I pressed play. At first, there was only hiss. Then, a man's voice, slurred with alcohol and arrogance. Don't know who you think you are, old man. It was Thomas Abernathy, younger but unmistakably him. Then my grandfather's voice, calm and cold as ice. I know exactly who you are, Tom. You're a killer. You can't prove a thing, Abernathy sneered. There's no body, there's no weapon, there's nothing. I don't need a body, my grandfather said. I have a witness who saw you drag her into your truck. I have the tire tracks from the logging road. I know you buried her in one of the old quarries. There was a pause, and the sound of a glass being set down hard. That's a lie. You're bluffing. Am I? My grandfather asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Sarah told her friend you threatened her. Said you told her if you couldn't have her, no one would. We have your truck, Tom. We're going to find her blood in it. It's over. The bluff. He was trying to rattle him, to get a confession, and it worked. Abernathy's voice dropped to a venomous whisper, the drunken bravado gone, replaced by pure, cold rage. She was a worthless tease. She got what she deserved. And you'll get what's coming to you. My family owns this town. They own you. This little report of yours will disappear. Your witnesses will forget, and you'll be gone. You touch me, and I will burn your life to the ground. The tape ended with a sharp click. I sat in stunned silence, the monster's voice still echoing in the small room. It was a confession, a direct, unequivocal confession. My grandfather had him, but Abernathy was right. The evidence disappeared, the witnesses clammed up, and my grandfather was forced out. He had lost the battle, but he had saved the proof. He had saved it for me. And now I understood the final piece of the puzzle, the back taxes, the development company. It wasn't just about building cabins. It was about getting this land. They must have suspected, or perhaps they knew, that my grandfather had taken something with him. They wanted to buy this property, tear it down, and bulldoze the last remaining piece of evidence against them, making sure the ghost of Sarah Jenkins was buried for good. The offer of $10,000 wasn't a gift. It was hush money. It was the price of my silence. I felt a surge of cold fury. They weren't just going to get away with murder. They were trying to use me to help them do it. I looked at the letter from the lawyer that Ms. Albright had given me. It had a name and a phone number. But I also remembered my grandfather's bookshelves. They were filled with law books. And tucked inside one of them, I'd found a business card. A different lawyer, a man named Ben Carter, with an office in Portland, would facilitate the sale and make this all go away. Or call the man my grandfather trusted. It wasn't a choice at all. I used my new phone and dialed Ben Carter's number. A secretary answered, and I asked to speak with him, saying it was about the estate of Arthur Vance. I was put on hold. I expected to be told he was busy, to be shuffled off to a paralegal. But after a minute, a warm, deep voice came on the line. This is Ben Carter. How can I help you? My name is Leo Vance. I'm Arthur Vance's grandson. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Arthur's grandson, he said, his voice filled with a strange mix of surprise and reverence. I'll be damned. I haven't heard that name in years. Your grandfather was one of the finest men I ever knew. What's going on, son? I took a deep breath and started from the beginning. I told him everything. About aging out of the system, inheriting the station, the back taxes, the offer from Redwood Corp. And then I told him what I had found in the trunk. I told him about the letters, the witness statements, and the tape. I spoke for 20 minutes straight, and he listened without interrupting once. When I was finished, the line was quiet for a long moment. He actually did it, Ben Carter said, his voice a low whistle. The old son of a gun. He saved it all. What do I do? I asked, my voice cracking slightly. The weight of it all was suddenly immense. First thing you do, son, is you don't talk to anyone else. Not the Redwood lawyer, not the county, nobody. Second, you sit tight. I'm driving up there. I'll be in Silver Creek tomorrow morning. Don't you go anywhere. The line went dead. Help was coming. For the first time in my life, I wasn't alone in a fight. The next morning, a clean, late-model sedan pulled up in front of the station. A man in his late 50s, with graying hair and a kind but weary face, got out. He was dressed in a simple suit that looked out of place in the decaying town. He looked at the old police station, then at me as I stood on the steps. "Leo Vance?" he asked. I nodded. "Ben Carter," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm. "You look like him, your grandfather. You have his eyes." He followed me inside, his gaze taking in the dusty lobby, the cold hallways, the office I had claimed as my own. I played the tape for him. He listened intently, his expression growing grimmer with every word. When it was over, he leaned back in the chair and let out a long, slow breath. "This is a confession to felony murder," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "The statute of limitations never expires on murder. Thomas Abernathy can still be prosecuted." "But will he be?" I asked. "They own this town. They own the county." "They don't own the state," Ben said, a hard glint in his eye. "And they don't own me. Your grandfather and I go way back. He was my investigator when I was a young prosecutor, before he moved up here for a quieter life. He taught me everything I know about building a case. When he came to me after he was forced out with his suspicions, I told him he needed more. He needed proof that couldn't be buried. "This," he said, tapping the cassette player, "is it." He spent the rest of the day looking through the contents of the trunk. He was methodical, just like my grandfather. He made notes, organized the files, and treated every piece of paper with a quiet reverence. "Arthur built a fortress of a case here," he said finally, looking up at me. "It's all here. Motive, opportunity, a confession, and a clear pattern of witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. The Abernathys didn't just cover up a murder, they waged a conspiracy against the entire legal system." "So we can win?" I asked, a fragile hope blooming in my chest. "It won't be easy," he warned. "They will come after you, Leo. They will try to discredit you. They'll dig into your past, your time in the system. They'll paint you as a troubled, delinquent kid looking for a payday. They will try to break you." He looked me straight in the eye. "Are you ready for that?" I thought of my grandfather sitting in this very office, making the impossible choice to risk his career for the truth. I thought of Sarah Jenkins, who never got to live her life. And I thought of the scared, lonely kid I had been for so long. That kid was gone. "I'm ready," I said. The first shot was a letter from Redwood Corp's lawyers, delivered by courier. It was an eviction notice. It claimed my ownership was in dispute due to the outstanding tax lien and that I was illegally squatting on their prospective property. They gave me 72 hours to vacate. Ben Carter just laughed when I read it to him over the phone. "It's a scare tactic. They have no legal standing. Ignore it." He filed a motion in county court to freeze any sale of the property pending a new criminal investigation. He also paid the $5,000 in back taxes out of his own pocket. "Consider it a loan," he said when I protested, "from one friend of Arthur's to another." The second shot was more personal. A county sheriff's deputy showed up at my door. He was young, nervous, and clearly hated his assignment. He said they'd received an anonymous tip that I was squatting in an unsafe building and dealing drugs. He asked to search the premises. I refused and told him to talk to my lawyer. He left, but the message was clear. They were coming for me. They were going to use the system my grandfather believed in to crush me. But Ben was one step ahead. He had already taken the trunk and all its contents back to his office in Portland for safekeeping, and he had made a copy of the tape, which he sent to a friend of his at the State Attorney General's office, along with a summary of the case. The fight was no longer just in Silver Creek. We had taken it to a higher level. In the weeks that followed, the station became my fortress. I worked tirelessly. I cleaned out the decades of dust and grime. I patched the leaky roof with tar I bought at the general store. I boarded up the broken window. I made the place my own. Martha, the store owner, started leaving a hot coffee and a sandwich on the steps for me every morning. She never said a word about it. She'd just nod at me when I came in to buy supplies. An old man named George, who had worked at the mill with my grandfather, stopped by. He told me stories about what a fair boss Arthur had been, how he'd stood up to the Abernathys even then. He offered to help me fix the station's ancient plumbing. Slowly, tentatively, I was being accepted. I wasn't just Arthur's grandson anymore. I was the kid who was staying, the kid who was fighting back. One rainy afternoon, a sleek black car I didn't recognize pulled up. A man in an expensive suit got out. He was in his 50s, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a face that was handsome but cold. I knew instantly who he was. Thomas Abernathy. He walked right up to the steps and looked at me, his eyes full of a chilling mixture of contempt and curiosity. "You must be the boy," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, nothing like the drunken rage on the tape. "You've caused quite a stir." I didn't say anything. I just stood there, my heart pounding, refusing to be intimidated. "I'll get right to the point," he said. "This is all a misunderstanding. My company is prepared to increase its offer for this property, substantially. Let's say $100,000, cash. All you have to do is sign the papers and hand over whatever sentimental junk your grandfather left you." It was a fortune. It was more money than I could even comprehend. But I just looked at him and thought of Sarah Jenkins. I thought of my grandfather's broken heart. "This property isn't for sale," I said, my voice steady. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "Don't be a fool, kid. You have no idea what you're messing with. Take the money and build a life for yourself. This isn't your fight." "My grandfather made it my fight," I said. He stared at me for a long moment, and for the first time, I saw something behind the cold mask. It was fear. He was afraid of me. A scared kid in a hoodie, living in a ruin. He was afraid because I had the one thing he couldn't buy, the truth. He turned without another word, got back in his car, and drove away. I knew then that we were going to win. The end didn't come with a dramatic courtroom showdown. It came with a quiet phone call from Ben. The Attorney General's office had convened a grand jury. Armed with the tape, the affidavits, and my grandfather's meticulous notes, they had reopened the case of Sarah Jenkins. They had found her remains, right where my grandfather said they would be, in an abandoned quarry on Abernathy land. Thomas Abernathy was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. His corporate empire began to crumble as the story hit the news. The town of Silver Creek, so long held in a grip of fear, began to breathe again. People started talking. More witnesses came forward. The rot that my grandfather had fought against was finally being cut out. The police station is my home now. The front lobby is my living room. My grandfather's office is my bedroom. I'm taking online classes to get my GED. Martha and George and a few other locals helped me get the power and water turned on for good. It's a strange life, but it's a good one. It's a life with purpose. Sometimes, at night, I sit in my grandfather's office and I look out the window at the quiet street. I think about the two gifts he left me, the choice to walk away and the truth that made me stay. He didn't leave me a building. He left me a legacy. He left me a chance to become the man he always knew I could be. He taught me that home isn't just a place with a roof and four walls. Home is the place where you stand for something. It's the place where you finish the fight. It's the ground you refuse to surrender. And this place, this dusty, broken-down old police station, is the only home I've ever known. This whole journey taught me something powerful. It taught me that your past doesn't have to define your future. It doesn't matter if you come from the system, from a broken family, or from a place of loss. What matters is the choices you make when you're given a chance. My grandfather gave me that chance. And maybe you're out there waiting for yours. Maybe you feel like you're stuck, like your story has already been written for you by other people. I'm here to tell you it hasn't. You are the author of your own life. Sometimes the hardest path is the one that leads to who you're truly meant to be. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight for your own second chance, I hope you'll subscribe and join our community here. And I want you to do me a favor. Go down to the comments and tell me about a time you chose the harder path. A time you stood up for something when it would have been easier to walk away. I read every comment because your stories matter. You matter. And together, we can remind each other that no one is ever truly alone in their fight.